Welcome to the last panel of Acahuch Symposium. My name is ACHMADI. You've seen me a couple of times. And together with my colleague Stuart King, we'll be co-chairing the panel. And before we start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which, the many lands on which we are located in this occasion. And I'm currently based in Narm or Melbourne, and I pay my respect to the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I would also extend my respect to the traditional owner of lands of many places in Southeast Asia and Pacific, and other First Nations people currently present. So panel 5, it has been a very fascinating and stimulating conversation the last 2 days, and I hope everyone have been enjoying that conversation. And in this panel, we have 3 very distinct papers, but I hope as you listen to the presentation and the conversation, the connecting points become obvious. The panel is titled loosely Heritage and Historical Memories. And the first speaker is Rad Youfsenia from University of Queensland. His paper is titled The Absent Referent of Exchange in South and Southeast Asian Trade, the Role of Iranian Trade Networks in Facilitating Colonial Commodities in 19th Centuries. The second paper is from Noni and Jean Bryce, titled Analysing 19th Century Military Building Typologies, an Australian Perspective. And the third paper is from Jane Jacobs and Victoria Marshall, titled Unlocking Maps, Locating Forms, Assembling the Digital Historic Maps of Southeast Asia Platform. And you will see that the act of mapping is sort of the beginning and also kind of the outcome of the fascinating exploration that you will hear soon. So I will now invite Ali to share screen. And for the audience, as in the previous session, please post your questions in the chat as we go.
Amanda, how much time I have?
We try to aim at 5 minutes, 5 to 8 minutes, and so we can have time to discuss afterwards.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. I also want to thank everyone at Acahuch and everybody being involved in this fantastic organization and panel, and also symposium. I really enjoyed all the papers that I could catch up and watch and sit in the sessions. So as Amanda mentioned, my title is a bit longer than other titles. It's The Absent Referent of Exchange in South and Southeast Asian Trade. And I also apologize because my presentation was a bit absent itself until like last days. So I had a bit of delay. My apologies on that again. So I'll try to cover all materials, but I'll also try to keep it short. So I'm not going to reiterate all the information which is in the pre-recorded presentation. And I'll also try to give a bit of like more explanation and like more of a detailed description on some parts. So the point referent and the word itself, where I borrowed, was from Carol J. Adams' book, The Sexual Politics of Meat, because Adams talks about how the meat and animal itself become completely absent during the process. It becomes absent in terms of turning to a commodity and meat. It becomes absent in a semiotic way. So we change names. Instead of saying pig, we say pork, ham, sausage, whatever you name it. And it's also becoming absent metaphorically. So in spatial terms, if we want to apply her idea and her concept, it also makes sense because we don't say slaughterhouse. Many people prefer to say meat factory, and they also change the name, and they also try to make it close, and they don't show anything. And that's the way that they completely cut the connection between the consumer and the process of the product. So I also talked about one of the most controversial things that we probably see every day, saying designed by Apple in California, assembled in China. And it's also showing this levels of alienation, how things are completely changing differently in this globalized world. So one thing can be designed in California, it can be assembled in China, but there's also some sort of connotation saying that because it was built in that place and it's designed in this place, it has its like qualities and so on. So going back to 19th century, we can see that a seed planted in the so-called Middle East, delivered by colonial imperial power, changed millions of lives in other parts of the world, particularly in Europe and in the so-called Far East. At the same time, a processed commodity such as tea or sugar produced somewhere under colonial influences transformed the Iranian context and patterns of consumption over there. The ironic example is the coffee house. The coffee house used to serve coffee for centuries. Then it started to serve tea, but it was still coffee house. People were calling it coffee house instead of saying tea house. And most importantly, the sugar started to get into that process, and we started to see lots of sugar consumption. So it's one of those ironic examples. And I remember Philip's question from our keynote speakers, that when carbonated iron was coming to that point, what was going back? So it was this process of transportation that ships were coming, so what we were taking back. So I started to dig in a little bit and try to understand what were the things exported and what was the things imported. I came up with Edward G. Brown's book, and it's titled A Year Amongst the Persians. And in his book, he mentions, he talks about the people who tries to give up on consuming opium, and says that they waste their time and other people's money in trying to put a stop to it. And in an Orientalist way, he talks about, on the other hand, how many of my friends here, when they feel depressed and worried or want to pass a quiet evening with a few congenial friends in discussing metaphysics and ontology, indulge in an occasional pipe. But it also raises this question that when opium export raised like almost 1/4 of the Iranian exports in this period that I'm showing in this chart, a famine came in 1870 and 1872, and almost 2 to 3 million people died. And as you can see, in early 1800s, there were lots of counterparts within the trade, but by the end of early 1900s, that we see it's just two counterparts are having the dominant power, Russia and Great Britain, particularly the Indian side of the Great Britain. And this is the chart that shows how competitive they were. And this is the global impact of the first industrial revolution. And the era that I put inside the red boxes particularly is the time frame that I'm studying for my PhD. And I tried to go to some of the primary text and descriptions of the history and geography, and I started to map some of these areas. I'm trying to keep it faster and try to make the pace a bit faster. So one of the ideas that I started to think about was rejection of the Eurocentric narrative of the scholarship. And over here we can see Janet Abulagod's work, and how she talks about the some sort of trade network back in 13th century and how it globalized before 18th century and 19th century, and how it ended with the Black Death and then gave a rise to European domination in 1400s, 1500s from Portuguese side, and then the British naval forces. And these two maps, when they sit next to each other, shows how things moved from one side to the other side. So when we think about the Islamic Iranian city in the 19th century, we come up with lots of Orientalist and also some sort of Eurocentric scholarship, how they narrate. So the city Iranian city for them is myth. For them, it's unknown. They just want to romanticize it, and they just want to see it as other. But what I try to do in my thesis is trying to create a different narrative from it. So I'm specifically looking at Bazaar, and Bazaar, the locus of the exchange. And it's the trace of development, the trace of change, and in many cases, it's also a trace of the revolution. And in 19th century, we see that within the colonial and imperial influences, a medieval and pre-modern institution resurrected again. So this building specifically in one of the parts of Bazaar is Mozaffariye Timche, which is built around 1890s. And from the human scale, you can see what sort of mega structure it is. And it was the center of carpet export, and many carpet mercantile had shops over here. And this is another part. This specific area is at the moment used by goldsmiths and gold trade, but originally it used to be textile mercantile back in early 1800s. And you can see how there are rhythmic patterns and how the structure is shaped, and it's some sort of traces of history, specifically 18th and 19th century history, because the whole city was completely demolished in that period. Yes. Just going through, and as we saw in the presentation for the digitized maps, I was very lucky to have some access to maps that I used for having the historical narrative. And I started to redraw these maps and try to understand the development of the Bazaar. I just want to finish the presentation with two works of masters in photography in the late 19th and early 20th century. Antoine Sevier captured children working in a carpet weaving atelier in Sultanabad on the left side, and the girl worker in cotton mill, Carolina, by Louis Hine. Both workers are absent in the eyes of the consumers on both sides of the world. And I just wanted to thank you all for having the attention. And I always had this sort of gaze of the cat that I captured almost 10 years ago. And every time I talk about this work, I start to think more and more and try to understand what are different things can be implemented.
Thank you, Ali. Great presentation. And I would like to invite Jean Rice, conservation architect, and Noni Boyd, architecture historian and heritage specialist, to present the second paper. Thank you.
Just sharing our screen. Our slideshow going. So yeah, I'm Jean, and this is Noni. I'm going to talk through the first part of our presentation, and Noni's going to talk about our conclusions. So the British Royal Engineers' designs spread around the world in the British colonies. Their buildings survive at former penal sites, particularly Sydney, Newcastle, and Norfolk Island. Construction techniques were spread by individual Royal Engineers, posted from England to one colony after another. Denison worked in Canada, Portsmouth, Woolwich, and Bermuda before Australia. Ideas were spread by the papers of the Royal Engineers. Denison edited this journal prior to his posting to Tasmania Standard Royal Engineers drawings also spread ideas. Initially, individual commanding officers selected designs based on their own experience. Many had served in the Caribbean. In the 1820s, a standard barrack was developed by the British Board of Ordnance. The design originated in tropical naval hospitals and had been used in New South Wales and Jamaica in the previous decade. Edward Hole, architect in the Navy Board, designed buildings for naval bases in the Caribbean, including the Naval Hospital at Port Royal. A prefabricated ironwork veranda replaced the arcades of the English barracks. Improved designs for the West India Barrack were published in 1838. Major George Barney, commanding Royal Engineer in Sydney, had a set of these drawings and had served in Jamaica. The influence of the standard design can be seen in barracks erected in Barney's term, like the Newcastle Barracks, which survived, and Victoria Barracks, which is still a barracks. The 1840 guardhouse on Goat Island is similar to a 1799 example in Halifax, Nova Scotia. On Cockatoo Island, the steam workshop was copied at Governor Denison's suggestion from an example in Portsmouth, published in the Royal Engineers Journals in 1853. The form of residences with verandas also has naval origins. The Dockyard Superintendent's residence at Port Frederick, Ontario, is similar to early official residences in New South Wales and Tasmania, which don't survive. Quarters in Australia are similar to those at dockyards in the Caribbean, such as Clarence House in Antigua. The now demolished Royal Naval Victualling Yard in London appears to have been the model for the Norfolk Commissariat store. The former penal settlement on Norfolk Island is a library of Royal Engineers building types, both British and colonial forms. Kingston was visited by the Royal Engineers from their office in Hobart, and their drawings of many buildings survive. Hamilton's plan shows a row of barracks, stores and quarters inland, and prisoners' buildings along the foreshore. 2 stores were erected in 1825. After flooding, they were converted to human-powered crank mills to grind grain as punishment for convicts. Grand Commissariat store was built in 1835. The old military barracks predates the Royal Engineers' arrival and is English in character without verandas. The new military barracks, office quarters and hospital all have verandas, reflecting the Royal Engineers' experience in design for the tropics. A row of stone houses includes first and second class quarters with verandas. The later modest Royal Engineers office is on the foreshore. Industrial structures include lime kilns, a brine concentration tank and salt works. Engineering structures include underground grain silos, bridges, drains, a water supply system, water collection tanks, and a stone pier. And Noni will continue with our conclusions.
The Royal Engineers buildings have been retained and reused across Australia. They are well designed, well supervised and built, and were built using durable local material. The standard designs were adapted to suit local climates with natural ventilation and daylighting, forerunners of today's environmental design. Their loose fit designs are adaptable to a wide range of uses, and their continuing use preserves embodied energy. The standard types were general purpose structures designed for easy adaptation around the world. Originally military buildings, they have a range of potential continuing uses. Understanding the agents and mechanisms of colonial development puts individual colonies and designs in context. Typologies missing in one colony survive in others and can be significant to the colonial story generally. Comparison of buildings in different British colonies allows understanding of the sequence, development and spread of building technology via the Royal Engineers. International comparative analysis and a study of building typologies reveals some aspects of significance missing in national architectural histories. Thank you.
That's our presentation. Thank you very much for listening, and thank you very much to the organisers who have done such a superb job.
Thank you, Jean and Noni. I'm just stepping in for Amanda at the moment. So our next presentation that I'd like to introduce is Jane Jacobs from the Yale, University of Singapore College, and also Victoria Marshall, also a visiting fellow in architecture at NUS.
Thanks, Stuart, and thanks everybody. I'll just get my presentation in the right order here. We're in London and Singapore, co-presenting from two different places, but we also would like to acknowledge that we're speaking at an event hosted on the lands of the Wurundjeri people who've been custodians of that land for thousands of years, and we acknowledge and pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. We'd also, of course, like to thank the hosts of this event. It's been a really useful opportunity for us to reflect on the work we've been doing for the last couple of years, which is to be producing a digital platform of digitized historical maps of Southeast Asia, primarily pre-1900 maps. This project has been facilitated by something called the IIIF, which is the International Image Interoperability Framework, which sits across cultural institutions all around the world now, libraries, museums, etc., who have got digitized assets. And that interoperability framework allows those assets to be shared quite easily between institutions. And our project was really a proof of concept project, that is, would institutions based elsewhere partner with us to share maps of regional interest to Southeast Asia. And our partner libraries were the Beinecke Library at Yale, the Bodleian Library at Oxford, the Leiden University Libraries, and the National Library of Singapore. The platform that we've produced, this is one of the opening pages of it, is still under development. It'll be launched May 2022. And a large part of the work we've done is to produce or enhance what we call the discoverability of the maps. So curating the maps into a one-stop place, and then to enhance the searchability of maps. Different libraries have got different types of metadata attached to the maps, and often and surprisingly, the content of the map, what the map actually shows, is not reflected in any of this metadata that libraries have. And so for scholars and for enthusiastic publics, actually knowing what's inside a map or what maps might be relevant to a thematic question is quite a difficult task. So we thought we could do this through machine recognition, but maps are very complicated with respect to automatic machine recognized image recognition. So we have done a manual process on the 1,000 or so maps inside of our collection, a manual process of tagging content within the map, such that a scholar could come to our platform and say, well, where are all the maps in Southeast Asia that show trade routes or factories? And we would, with that search term ticked, they could find all the maps so depicting those kinds of functions. And so we're trying to enhance the usability and discoverability of maps in various ways, and this is just a version of that. Next slide. Thank you, Victoria. And then I think it's over to you, actually, Victoria.
Yes. So the maps accessible through our platform serve as historical source material in a number of key ways. First, as maps are intended to record and communicate geographical features in a manner that is accurate and trustworthy, they can serve as relatively reliable sources of information about the past. That said, cartographic representations of the world are always inframed by the rationalities that existed at the time of their production. They can only show location, distance, or direction as accurately as the technologies of the time allowed. In this sense, historical maps always need to be parochialized as sources, and the parochial facts of the means of their production are as important as the world phenomena they depict. Finally, maps often also contain explicitly imagined geographies. This is especially so of the maps associated with imperial times, when travel and mapping served expanded systems of resource extraction or territorial appropriations. As scholars like J.B. Harley or Matthew Edney or Thongchai Winkachul or David Turnbull have shown, in many contexts, maps express power and were used as instruments in the realization of authority over territories and populations. Over to you, Jane.
Thanks, Victoria. So it's really appropriate and was very exciting for us at the conference, focused on the interdependent themes of encounter and exchange, which have long structured the relationship between Southeast Asia to navigating and traveling societies, both within and outside of that region, noting that that region is itself a kind of modern construct. And those cultures of trading and travel are often associated with the mercantile travels of any society, from the Chinese through to Arabic traders, and largely associated with commerce, but more latterly, of course, the political imperiums and commercial imperiums of European entities, such as the Spanish, the Portuguese, and the Dutch, or the British. And these are just two images that are kind of suggestive from the collection. In our paper, we showcase these maps, or a selection of our maps, really like a taster showcase of the maps inside of the collection, on three themes: trading routes, port buildings, and urban plans, which are, of course, if you like, part of the land infrastructure for that maritime infrastructure. And then specifically hone in on some commercial areas of settlement. And we offer a number of caveat statements about the maps, and we acknowledge that the maps, of course, offer worldviews that are of traders, explorers, surveyors, colonials, and they are from institutions which are themselves often colonial entities, such that the collections are reflecting biases of dominant or empowered representational entities. So, you know, there's larger projects that we might have which might disrupt the sort of authority that is held within maps such as this. But our hope is, and one of the things we would note, is that the map archive can be really used in a much more productive way in and of itself, and not simply just as a source material. And you will notice that some of the earlier maps that we showcase are very, very explicit in terms of representing scenic or diagrammatic annotations of the cartographic knowledge held in it. But as our maps modernize and come into the period of specific interest to this conference, often those scenic or illustrative elements disappear into a much more unified and systematic, integrated, actually, it's like a global language of mapping, which actually makes the later maps often harder to use, harder to yield the kind of information we might want to have with respect to urban development or settlement patterns and or architectural features. We have, I'll just finish with a couple of other maps. For example, this really beautiful map, earlier than the period of the conference, which has its north actually to the bottom of the map and shows the north coast of Java, Java being the green that looks a bit oceanic, but is actually Java with all of its volcanoes. Shows here Bantam and Batavia, two early ports as almost equivalent entities, and we know that history across time that Batavia completely usurps Bantam, and which disappears in importance relative to Batavia. And finally, we might just showcase, just to remind everybody of the nature of the maps, the ways in which later maps offer us very useful insights into urban form and urban development. Here, this map illustrating a Desakota condition, commerce and agriculture, industry and agriculture interspersed in a way that was later made was very celebrated as distinctive of a Southeast Asian kind of urbanism in the Desakota condition. And I'll just go to the final slide. Please do have a look at the maps in May 2022 when we launch, and we would very much like to talk to scholars who have other ideas for how we might take this project in different directions, not least towards areas, mapping traditions that are not included in our current collection. So thank you.
Thanks, Jane and Victoria, for your presentation, and also thank you, Jean and Noni, and also Ali for your presentations. So we'd like to encourage everybody to start putting some questions into the chat or raising their hand during the discussion. But in the first instance, I think as Amanda noted in the introduction, we think there's a series of connections between these papers to do with ideas about mapping, and perhaps also to do with places and buildings sitting within larger systems. So for example, Ali's discussion of Iran's urban bazaars within global trading networks, and Jean and Noni talking about the work of the Royal Engineers in New South Wales and Norfolk Island, which of course sits within much wider tours of duty of the engineers, and of course the whole kind of core as a global organisation. And then we're seeing this project which is bringing maps, or making these maps available that variously represent the types of connectivities and places that we're talking about. So I guess I wanted to maybe just begin the conversation by asking if the presenters would have any questions for each other, just in relation to their own work and the work that we're seeing presented in this session. Ali.
I was on mute, so I muted myself. Thank you so much. Thanks, Stuart. My question is from Jane and Marshall's project, because it's sorry, Victoria and Jane's project. It's a fantastic platform, and I'm pretty sure it's going to be very useful. And it's a big burden when we think about like primary materials, and within the COVID time, how we can reach to all these materials. Yeah. And it's a fantastic opportunity if anyone is working on this part of the world and needs some sort of primary data, they can reach to it. My question is a bit technical than something related to content of the whole project, because it also relates to my work as well. When I got a 10 megabyte map and I can zoom in and see all details, it's completely different than when I got like a 500 kilobytes of a map. And I know it's almost impossible to just accommodate that much of data and information. So do you have any sort of techniques, policies, or like some sort of workflow that, because at the moment you sit next to a physical map and you get a magnifier and look at it with so much of details, you can see many, many things. But when you see a pixel version of a physical material, it's completely something else. So I was curious that, is there any sort of consideration for that? Because I saw in one of the maps, you had a very close up and zoom in, and there were lots of information on that, but I'm just curious about this part.
Victoria, have you got anything to say initially around that? I've got some thoughts, but
yeah, I just would agree with Ali. My research was is in Kolkata, and I looked at many maps I found online, and I really wanted to zoom in, and it just turns into a blur. And so and that's very frustrating, because you know there's something in there that you really want to know. And so yes, Jane can talk about the amazing resource that the platform offers to get through that.
Yeah, the Zoom is a fantastic feature. So you know, what we showed you, of course, was the thumbnails that come up when you do a particular word search, or you might get to it via a geographical search. And you click on those thumbnails, you go in and you can zoom right into the detail. The resolution is very high. So think Google Culture, the Google Culture site, that's the sort of quality that we're aiming for. And some of our special projects are exactly about that, really trying to show people what can be yielded from when you zoom in. Of course, I think as historians, we always have to, some of the most charming parts of maps when you zoom in sit unstably between a fiction and fact, and particularly when they're those charming, like one of them we showed even just in the shorter presentation, has beautiful illustrations of rice farming and rice cultivation at a scale that's much larger than the actual map scale. So you've got this weird scalar thing going on. And of course, they're very evocative. But there's always this uncertainty about the illustrative aspects of maps. Many of the early maps have got buildings on them, and understanding the accuracy of those buildings is difficult, I guess.
I also find this like turning point in maps that I was studying. So when foreign engineers are coming, and especially if it's a military campaign, they just want to document as much as they want and they can when they're over there. It's always outside to inside looking. So they look at the stronghold and the walls and gates, then get in, then they don't care a lot. Like it falls into some sort of like simplification. But there's this turning point. There's a technical school, had graduates in cartography, and they start to map from inside to outside. Then it's completely something else.
Yeah, I think that's something that's a really, we also, I think, noticed a version of that point you're making in passing in the longer presentation. That is, the earlier maps will often have these illustrative annotations, insets, we'd call them, a scene of Batavia, the port of Batavia, maybe even a scene of Batavia under a certain condition of, a certain battle, for example. And these are all outside looking in, but they're also addressing the outside. They're really, those scenes are to tell European viewers over there about what the achievements of, the Dutch Indies are there. So, they really have a very specific structure of looking. Whereas when you get into the later period of, for example, the Dutch, colonial era, when you've really got management of populations and people and populations and resources. You've got local management, localized management issues, colonial but localized. Your whole language of representation changes. I think that's a version of what you're saying about the looking in, and actually very strangely and interestingly and unthought through, I think at this point, is, the aerial view becomes very prominent then. And it's not long between those, the sort of what I'd call for me, late colonialism actually begins where early colonialism begins in the Southeast Asian region. But, from about 1850 on, it's not that many decades until you have your first actual aerial surveys by planes. So there's some very interesting things that are going on representationally. But I think they resonate with Jean and Nomi's paper as well, where you're really relying on that representational culture of the time to pull together the evidence, although you're also not so much, not necessarily mapping, but certainly scenes, the scenes, as well as the drawings, the architectural drawings.
I mean, in fact, the map records, including things like surveyors' field books, which exist for, say, the 1848 Hamilton map. The field books are in the National Library. Those maps have been very important, especially as people were journeying around the world by sea. So there's a map that's in our full presentation that presents the colonies of Australia and the near Pacific as an archipelago. So they saw them as islands, like Indonesia is island, because their access was by sea. So
yes.
it expresses a view of the world that is very different from what we see now. What we see as remote, like Norfolk Island, wasn't remote. It was just as close, just as accessible as South Australia or Melbourne or Perth. But one of the things we've never managed to do is to get into the Royal Engineers Archive in Chatham. And there's likely to be a lot of very interesting material there, including maps, because of the, that was part of their skills mapping.
Why has it been difficult to get into that archive? Could I ask?
Oh, never managed to. I mean, we're doing it. We're not researchers. We're doing it as part of our work. So it's not as if they don't.
It's not as if they're not letting publics look at their work. It's just more of a.
Yeah. Oh, and I think we sort of don't have a research project that would validate it, nor the funds to get to the UK.
Yeah,
nor now the ability, but it's something we'd love. Something we'd love to do one day.
Yeah.
Can I ask it from Jen and Noni, have you ever come up with any mapping of indigenous landscape as well within the project? Because like when we look at like 1800s Brisbane maps, we realized the engineers are getting in and trying to map indigenous landscape, then start to make the urban development plans and catastrophe plans. And also, like, do you see any sort of like arrangements within the buildings that you were talking? Because it's some sort of like sitting over there heavily, but like, I don't know if they have any sort of like, overarching politics behind it.
We were looking at the penal settlements rather than the broader settlement. So they're very small areas. So there isn't really any Indigenous mapping at all. Even the names and things, they're all what's imposed by the engineer.
I mean, one of the things that we did do as a sort of part, as a joke early on, was decided we needed to go to all the towns called Kingston. And Kingston in Ontario does have buildings by the Royal Engineers, as does Kingston, Jamaica, so that the naming is part of their imposing their order on the landscape. In Norfolk Island in particular, there wasn't an Indigenous population, although historically there had been occupation by Polynesians. So in the earliest map by Raper in 1792, there is in fact a banana plantation recorded, which is thought to have been from the Polynesian people who had abandoned that site
Or died out.
or died out, we don't know. But yeah, I mean, in other projects, what I've seen in mapping of Indigenous sites by surveyors, particularly in stuff that I've done along the Darling River and the Murrumbidgee River, but not from Norfolk Island.
While we're very much in this conversation about mapping, we can see questions starting to come through. And so what we might do is just work through the papers and perhaps in reverse order to carry on this conversation. So Jane and Victoria, Pedro has a question. Pedro, would you like to put the question to Jane and Victoria? Okay. Well, in that case, I'll read it out. So Pedro notes the Portuguese cartography may need careful further consideration. Sadly, the archives with holdings are very dispersed, but the Biblioteca Nacional de España and the Biblioteca Nacional de Portugal have good holdings, much of it in manuscript, and some of it's already digitized. French, British, Belgian, Brazilian libraries also have significant collections, and he asks, I would welcome a discussion about this probably beyond the conference. So I don't know if there are any perhaps general comments you'd like to make on that.
Yeah, it's a really great question, Pedro. And one of our collaborators is Peter Borschberg, who you may know of his work. He actually has done a lot of work on the Portuguese in the Southeast Asian region, the really early mercantile Portuguese presence, and so has uncovered a large number of these maps. And he knows where most of those maps are, not all of them, and you're correct, they're very dispersed. And they're very so some of the best Portuguese map collections are actually in France, not just in the Spanish collections, as you mentioned there. What we chose to do in the project was go with 4 partner libraries that were willing to go on this adventure with us, which was to explore what could happen to build a regional-based resource about a region through the IIIF protocol. So we've always noted, and we didn't do it this time, but we've always said, if we were to choose the best archives, maps of Southeast Asia, would they be our 4 partner libraries? Maybe not. And the Portuguese collections, the cartographic collections, is a case in point there. Relatedly, just going back to this idea of Indigenous mapping or Indigenous presence, you know, we know the sort of representational violation, not just the other violations of colonial mapping projects, that they obliterate not just the presence, but also other kinds of representational, or they dominate other kinds of representational frameworks, be they oral or Indigenous representational frameworks. And I think we said to Ali earlier on, maybe it was before the recording, most of those things are not in cartographic or the map sections of libraries. Most of those really early representations of Indigenous mapping may likely be inside of manuscripts that might, for example, be related with an early Sultanate presence in the case of the Malay archipelago, for example. So piecing together those other maps, I think, is a really important project. We would hope it to be in subsequent phases of the project. Now we know how to do what we're doing.
Thanks, Jane. I think Elliot also has a question. I think we can see a few questions coming about some of the spatial possibilities of the maps. Elliot, would you? Okay. So Elliot's asking, does the digital map archive include urban atlases? And is there any future desire to make them commensurate spatially, so to speak? Though I realise that may be far more difficult, if not impossible, for early maps. And then he has given an example.
Victoria, do you want to take this question?
Yeah, I was just trying to look at the, it was regarding whether a map is versus a technical drawing. Yeah, we do, there are categories. I was just trying to pull up the categories and send them to you. So I was a little distracted just then. Yeah, let me find them and I'll put them in the chat.
Can I mention something? I think what Jane just made as a comment is completely related to Jasper's question in the chat about what you consider as map, or what are the things falls into that category. Maybe we can just...
Yes, would you like to speak to your question?
Sure. Yeah. I was just intrigued in the recorded presentation that that there was a sort of, I guess, a connection made from the cartographic scale through to the actual technical scale of a building occupying a site, and whether that's intentional, and if that coupling of those scales is a sort of analytical tool, or if it's incidental to the archival material. Because as an architectural historian, it's obviously interesting to be connecting the broader cartographic scale with the specificity of the building, and the challenges of that, questions about evidence, and is sort of what my question in the chat is about.
We actually only have one architectural drawing in the collection. It's sort of somehow, somehow slipped into one of the map collections. So the map collections of the holding libraries, the partner libraries, are largely, cartography as we would understand cartography. But early cartography often had these insets and these annotations. So they're almost always aerial view plan, the standard cartographic imagination as we understand it to be, but often have these insets which are scenic, and so offer a different kind of perspective. Also, in the maps, the earlier maps, there are often these illustrative elements, and so they are very rich and rewarding, suggestive. And as I say, I think the illustrative thing starts to disappear, and you end up in this language of legends and symbols as time goes on, a sort of iconography, iconographic, a standardized iconographic language as the maps become, by the 1830s, it's really basically much more standardized. I'm not sure, Jasper, if that captures your question. We didn't set out to find illustrative or scenes of cities, but we did set out to find what we call routes and nodes. So all along, because the Leiden collection is huge, all along we had an eye for city plans, if we could get them.
Can I pop in here on, this is Pedro, about cartographic issues? One of the things that could actually illuminate your work a lot is the rutters that were produced, the views, navigational aids, which took profiles of what could be seen from the sea of the land. And there are Portuguese ones. There are also Spanish ones that are very, very important. And you know, those are also mainly in manuscript. But on the town plans and cities, one of the most interesting documents in that area is a production in the 1630s by which was ordered by Philip II or Philip III of Spain for a survey of all the cities, fortifications in the Portuguese Estado da India, which covered the whole of the Indo-Pacific. And you know, that there are drawings of all the fortifications and cities with all the houses drawn in. I mean, they're very inaccurate. Some of them are more accurate than others, but the cartographic ideas in those drawings are very different to the Dutch, who had a much more sophisticated, you know, Vingbunds operating a few years later was capable of doing serious cartography. But look, I did put another question in the chat, which was I've always had great problems with very early maps of the Indian Ocean and the archipelagos. I mean, there's the Cantino map, I think it is, from about 1509, somewhere in Italy, which actually shows a recognizable distribution of islands and peninsulas and all that. And that would have been absolutely impossible for Portuguese cartographers to have recorded those shapes and distributions. So there must be a whole other cartography that has never ever been found, that was to do with Arab seamen, Asian sailors and all that. And that is, but a kind of little clue that I've come across is the idea that the Turks were actually involved, because the Portuguese fought the Turks in the Indian Ocean. The great Turkish Admiral Piri Reis was actually a great cartographer as well. And, you know, that they were stealing each other's maps. The Portuguese, the Turks, they were all very interested in these things. They were highly precious documents. So,
sorry, can I just quickly jump in?
Okay, sorry.
Jane and Victoria, I wonder if you might just briefly respond to Pedro.
Yeah, Pedro, it's so interesting, Pedro, and you probably know the work of Peter Borschberg. He's one of the partners one of the historians on the project, and you know, we're a little bit constrained by the partner libraries that we have, but we really are very aware of this big yet to be done, this sort of it's a sort of absence inside of the collection, and it's an artifact of the partner libraries that we have, as opposed to us going to find the best libraries that have got the best maps of Southeast Asia. We wanted to sort of do proof of concept first. So you're absolutely right. The Arabic mapping of Southeast Asia is hugely interesting and important, as is the intersection between local knowledges, indigenous knowledges of various kinds, and the very early maps that start to appear in Europe. Knowing that sometimes that mapping happens without, you know, the presence. It is happening through a set of communicated ideas, through images and representations that are moving through networks that are obscure to us currently, or only partly known to us.
Jane, I would add in there that our work has been to geolocate the maps and allow for the maps to, if they can be, because some of them are imagined, as we know, you know, overlaid, and you can read through them. And then we have increased, like we said, the searchability. So rather than just searching for the title or the date or the map maker or the publisher, we added this metadata, which was the terms of, what's inside the map. And so really that's the work we've done for the collections, but we do have a section in the interface for what we're calling special projects. And I think this is where the storytelling can come in. And so I think we've started to do some storytelling around cartouches here. But I think that I know there's opportunity to sort of, there's a container within the interface to highlight these stories, these ways of finding through finding out what how the cartographies emerged and learned from each other, through using the interface. Yeah. So I don't know. I really look forward to the special projects emerging. But really, what we're creating is the tool, so we can all speak. Yeah.
Now, I know that we have some other questions. Hannah, you had a kind of question about sub-imperial networks. I just wonder if that's a really quick question you might be able to put, and then we'll sort of perhaps flow through to the other papers.
That was for Noni and Jean anyway.
Perfect. Yeah.
So yeah, the other question was just, I think it was related anyway. We sort of covered it, that someone asked about whether the maps could be aligned spatially, and I'd sort of been thinking about the same thing and thinking with such diverse maps that's going to be pretty impossible, and it's such a difficult task anyway, and we were trying to do it in a project on Melbourne, but just saying that the Public Records Office of Victoria has now got a program, Map Warper, to do it with their maps. It's still temperamental though, that whole problem of alignment, but it is pretty powerful when it works.
I agree. We chose not to do alignment,
Yep.
and we felt the value out of it in our collection was not good. But as Victoria put in the chat, Singapore, the Geography Department at National University of Singapore has done a very, very successful overlay map project. And, I think there's various libraries. New York has got a fantastic map overlay project. If the maps are sort of within a fairly standardized, what we'd understand to be a modern, geolocated logic, then it's fairly easy to do. It's not fairly easy to do, but it's worth doing. But with the earlier maps, there's so much, so many different rationalities. There's no point to really warping.
Hannah, do you want to perhaps start the conversation about Jean and Noni's work on the Royal Engineers with this question about sub-imperial networks?
Sure, just briefly. I was just thinking, I don't know, from the conversations yesterday in the session that I chaired, sort of talking about this level of international networks that operated below the level of nation states, I guess, and your work is really, I thought, interesting from the point of view of how much more we could gain out of having a sort of better international heritage organisation collaboration to be able to sort of chart some of these networks, as at the moment it's down to, like you're saying, as professionals, you having to travel or to, but it is just a really difficult thing. But I was just, I mean, in 20th century work, like Noni would, you know very well, Docomomo tries to do that as an international networker, and I just wondered whether UNESCO is useful, or I don't know.
Well, what we ended up trying to do was basically we're searching for images of the buildings. So we put in the name of the building, and then the towns that we knew were built by the Royal Engineers. So it was really hard to find examples. So there's probably a whole lot more that when we did this work weren't online. So a lot of the work depends on the material actually being scanned and us being able to having it identified as who designed it and when it was designed. So that's the important thing for us for the international comparative, is being able to access images of the buildings and the date they were built and who designed them.
But I think there's also a possibility that you point out there, Hannah. We gave a similar paper at a Defence Heritage Conference in Venice, which one of the organisers, her dad was a Royal Engineer, and she hadn't realised this concept. But yeah, it would be something that, if it could happen at some sort of an institutional level, that the global networks get linked back to, in this case, their origin in the UK.
John Ting, I see you have your hand up.
I think John's question is for Ali.
Okay.
I was just wondering, Noni and Jean, if you can elaborate a little bit that fascinating map that represents Australia as part of that archipelago, and I was wondering, in your tracing of those military buildings, in fact, you are in the process of producing a certain kind of maps that again talks about this movements. If you can just expand on how that map.
It wasn't so much a map we produced, but it was a chart of typologies. So we tried to look at each site that had lime kilns and each site that had salt works and the commissariat stores and things, because we were trying to use this to assess whether or not sites were rare or representative. So it was all to do with what each colony had with the buildings, and whether they had the Colonial Hospital, and whether they had the barracks. So it was this enormous chart, and that was difficult to confirm with each site what the sort of smaller buildings were. Like on Norfolk Island, there's this very deep well where you walk down into it, which is maybe Indian in origin. That's a very rare feature. We haven't seen another one of those in Australia, but they may be in other sites. And we were just hampered by the lack of information about comparative sites at an international level.
Jean and Noni, I think, and again, the answer to this might be in the comment that you've just made about the difficulties around comparative analysis. But one of the things that really interests me with the Royal Engineers is, we know that they kind of toured, and over the course of their careers, they may be in 5, 6, 7 different countries. And from what I've seen, I'm familiar with the ones that were in Tasmania. They're often there for around 6 or 7 years, and then they went on to somewhere else. And so you start to identify some of the connections to where they've been prior to Australia. I wonder, do you ever see any indications of influence from experience in the Australian colonies then going elsewhere through their work?
Lots of them stayed here. So say some of the architects who then became just architects in Sydney, they chose not to, like in the 1850s, they chose to remain in the colonies and not to, because there wasn't enough funding from the British for them to continue to be employed. So some went to Adelaide. Some of the early architects in Adelaide had previously worked in Sydney, and before that they'd been just working on these barracks complexes. So we haven't really looked outside of where they went after, other than in, say, in the Encyclopedia of Australian Architecture, that picked up that how they had moved like that.
There's some, like Denison, we know did go on to India, and he was a governor in India. We don't know what sort of works he did then. I mean, as governor, he's not actually designing buildings, but when
making suggestions.
Yeah, when he was governor here, he still took an interest in building and planning. But, one of the other things that we became aware of in looking at those penal colonies is the influence of a whole lot of other networks. So in the context of papers we heard yesterday, Norfolk Island has also had a whaling station. It was on whaling routes. There's, you know, they celebrate Thanksgiving because the American whalers brought it to Norfolk Island. They're also on Pacific trade routes, trading goods across the Pacific.
And there were the plant collectors who went and got the pines, and then you see them appearing in botanic gardens.
So that some of the German material from Bauer and so on is relevant. And stuff in America that I don't know how the Burne-Jones stained glass window drawings of Norfolk Island ended up in America, but they are. But you know, there's a whole lot of interrelated networks that tell a fascinating story. Fishing, lots of things. Yeah.
I think it is interesting the point that you make about movement then within the Australian colonies and into kind of private practice. And so the way, you know, their kind of network then operates regionally, and to then be putting that against this, you know, amazing map of the archipelago of Australia where the continents have been dissolved, and all we're looking at is those settlement towns. Yeah. John, do you want to ask your question?
Thanks, Stuart. My question is for Ali. And Ali, thanks for your presentation. I thought it was fascinating work there. I mean, really the spheres of influence map that you showed, you know, and the overlaps between them, I think was particularly interesting for me. I'm just myself researching a different part of that in Southeast Asia rather than Iran, but that map really resonated with me. But I think my question is really more about the market or the bazaar that you showed, and it's, I think it's also interesting that you've got that you're able to trace the development of the bazaar over the years through the maps that you've got. But what I wanted to ask was was it always something that was roofed? So, you know, it's a series of streets really that have been roofed over.
Yeah. So structurally, if I may say, it really relates to climate. So that's why we cannot define some sort of a well-structured institution or building and name it like bazaar. It might be completely an open marketplace. If it's hot and humid, the pathways will be narrower and walls will be higher to make the circulation. And the place that I showed to you snows around 9 months a year, like I may say, sometimes maybe 6 months. So that's why pathways started to be covered. But there's also a good relation between open space and built space, or I may say built and unbuilt space. So those unbuilt spaces start to be like storage spaces. So I had a picture that I didn't have that one in the presentation, but you can see from 19th century, late 19th century, commodities and goods coming from Georgia, and particularly from Russia. And because tea was coming, the thing that needs to like make tea ready were also coming, but that we call samovar. And samovar is like some sort of a word travels between Russia and Iran. So they were importing goods from over there and they were restoring it over there. But like the whole idea and the whole presentation and the whole, like the main concept is going beyond the physical realm. I'm talking about as a quality. So the bazaar that I'm talking suffered many, many layers of history. I may say it destroyed many times. It was 1787, if I'm not mistaken. It was 1780s that it completely flattened by an earthquake. So it resurrected, but it resurrected with lots of anomalies, I may say, because there were lots of commodities and goods coming from different parts of the world. And again, going back to Philip's comment, ships were coming, so they won't go back empty, right? So trade routes of British steamers in 1830s, 1840s onwards started to build up a trade route between Trabzon and Tabriz, my hometown, and some coastal area in Turkey. And from that point, we can see that the there is a big rise of like the built environment as well. And we can see it as a development rather than just talking about its physical realm. So we can see how hierarchical space is, and nobody talks about it in that way. And talking about sugar, as I mentioned, it was coming mostly from India and Indian subcontinent and Southeast Asia. So I found the specific space in this conference to present this paper to say that things were going from your destination port, right? But where they're going, what are they going to do? And things were coming from that point, right? Opium crisis, opium consumption. Like talking about opium and its calamity on the other side of the shore is something, but seeing 2 to 3 million people died because of a catastrophic climate situation and also drought, because of the replacement of cotton and its shortage during an American Civil War, and opium crisis somewhere in Southeast Asia, and its production space. And it should be some sort of correlation. It needs to be connected. We cannot just talk about where they're going or like what are the things coming and making it. So I see it in that way. That's why my research is about trade networks rather than talking about a locus. That's why I started to read a lot, and I try to go in between interdisciplinary areas, specifically economics and historical economy and historical materials that what were the main motivators in this situation. Yeah.
Thanks, Ali. I mean, it's very interesting because you know, the area that I'm dealing with is it's somewhere which produce things, right? It's somewhere which produce things, jungle products, or what they now call non-forest timber products for export out of Borneo and through Southeast Asia and beyond. And then in exchange, the traders, as you say, they came with full boats and they left with full boats, right? So they came with things like pots and pans and ceramics and beads and fabrics, and they left with timbers and beeswax and honey and so on and so forth. But I think what was really interesting for me, in this is relating it back to myself, I think is the fluid nature of the bazaar, and in Southeast Asia there's a loan word. Bazaar is a loan word in the Austronesian languages such as Malay, where it's called the pasar, the P-A-S-A-R. Yeah. And I think bringing to it my own sort of Eurocentric approach to it, when I was looking for pasar or bazaars in my own context in Borneo, I couldn't find a building. You know, I could not find a building. And then talking to one of the old ladies in one of the settlements, I realized that actually the pasar was not a building, but it was an idea of this exchange. For many years, it was actually just held in the street between the shops and the river. So so I think this kind of fluid form of the institution, if you like, or the facility.
If you don't mind, I just want to refer to text that I had. So when we talk about the word itself, and I have this tendency to go to the roots of words. I don't know, it's a bit of a doom thing because sometimes I'm stuck with words and can process in the situation. When we talk about bazaar, it's the location of exchange, trade and commerce, and it also refers to the location of gathering. But when we look at a broader sense, in Turkish language, I'm fluent in Turkish and Azerbaijani and Farsi and English. When we look at like bazaar or like the pazar that you're saying, it's Sunday in Turkish. So because it's the Sunday market, they call it pazar, right? So when we look at it, it's more of a like idea. It can be anything. It can be anything when we look at its like extended meanings. And it can be also a street. So it's a very big concept which falls to completely different, and it's also relating to all this like trade that language travels, like disease travel, like commodities travel. like the map that I showed to you from 1400s, like the Black Death plague, is actually the trade route, right? And when we go and trace how COVID started to spread in different parts, it's exactly the same thing. So history is just repeating itself. And the reason that it spread it this much fast was all airlines that we couldn't, and they just came to start to like put a stop, but they cannot because we're addicted to speed. So yeah, thanks for a great question, John. Thank you.
If I can just follow up, expand that conversation a little bit, Ali. I think what is fascinating about your research is how this flow of commodities, in a way, help resurrect the function of bazaar as kind of civic heart of settlements in Iran. I'm just wondering, you know, whether there is, you talk about, you know, the spatial expansion of bazaar to accommodate these commodities. I'm wondering if there is something that that can be traced in the architectural expression of the bazaar that sort of indicate the origin of these commodities more so than providing space to trade these commodities. The reason why I ask is because, you know, we have this perception that Middle Eastern architecture, you know, the Orientalist understanding of Middle East architecture as being, you know, something that is unique of the geographical and cultural context. But, you know, if I contrast it with Bali or Balinese architecture, they have features that clearly link the influence of contact with Chinese culture, the use of ceramics and so on. Is there any traces, physical traces that hint to the origin of the commodity, or whether the commodity have assumed its own identity?
So if I want to give a very like specific, but also hearing from ear example, like there used to be mirrors coming in to Iran from Sham, probably from Damascus, and they were going to the direction of the east. To East Asia, and many of them were broken. So what we were doing with these broken mirrors, it's some sort of a very local narrative. I'm not saying it's a proven thing, but they started to use those mirrors in like ornaments in buildings. So, or if I want to talk about anything that relates to this discussion, the origin of commodities that when we trace, like there are production spaces, right? So from a Brudelian sense, there are 4 types. One is like small ateliers. The other one is a bit of an extended one, producing one level, then passing to another. Then there's the big workshops, and there's the other one is the industrial level, which I'm a bit like skeptical about whenever I see a heritage preservation, industrial heritage discussion. It's always the 4th one, not the first, not the second, not the third. And the image that I showed to you at the end of my presentation, if it's a factory in the United States from 1900s, yes, it will be preserved. There will be like sort of like rehabilitation processes and all these like preservation plans for it. If it's an atelier in Iran or anywhere like remote from like a Eurocentric sense, it's gone. There's nothing, right? So what is my role as a scholar? Which one should I just start to like pick up or document or talk about? But if you look at the gaze of those people, there were humans working over there, and they're looking at the camera exactly at the same gaze, right? So going back to your question, it's very easy to trace. So for making the general framework of my study, I started to read from 1200s and 13th century, and I came to that point. When we talk about coffee, the origins of like coffee in Iran is coming from Southeast Asia and also Yemen and some parts in the Middle East. So there's a coffee house, and it was functioning until 16th century as a coffee house. Then it started to change as tea place, but still calling as the coffee house. But like the unique situation in this specific bazaar, sorry if I'm hijacking the panel a bit like I'm talking about. So the unique specification of that bazaar is it survived. Many bazaars had all these Haussmannian sort of like modernization processes and urban transformation plans, and they destroyed. But today, what we are talking about is 6 kilometers of all these covered pathways with almost 27 acres of commercial space. Never studied in a hierarchical or some sort of like ideological concepts of it and how it's shaped.
Right. Thank you, Ali. I'm just mindful of the time, but there is this 2 very interesting comments before I hand back to Stuart to wrap up. From Erika Yuniastuti, she's researching batik in Indonesia, which is this painted fabric, and found out trace of Iranian architectural ornament into the batik form. So that's fascinating. So I think you guys can link up and then do a conversation about that. So it means that there's something actually coming to the other direction. It's not just about the commodities going from Southeast Asia to the Middle East.
Sorry, I just missed the question. Is it in?
It's a comment. It's on comment. So Erika, maybe you want to say it quickly?
Yeah, I just want to say, like, I never thought that I will find out the ornament in this blue palace in Tehran. I forgot the name, but it's exactly the same one with the batik that I was researching now, and never mind I saw it. Like, but I need like a proof if it's really connected. But yeah, it's like my research of this.
Like,
thanks.
Don't think about what I said as a like a proof, historical evidence that yes, there were people seeing it like, yeah, it's broken, but like some sort of reusage, right? Then we like see like vintage culture, like yeah, we want to use something that is like recycling and stuff. Like what we were doing, like they started to do all these like sort of ornaments, maybe not, we don't know, but like this is one example of lots of different historical narratives if we go through all these texts. So I have a text from one of the court members that there is a gate, it's called Bloody Gate. And they call it Bloody Gate for years. Like, and when you go to the text and when you start to dig into the text, you realize they were a government official and someone as like some sort of a big guy going around like some sort of like gang member. So the guy is just chopping his head in front of everyone and the blood is going everywhere and it's some sort of like called as Bloody Gate after that. But it's over there and it has spatial implication. So it's giving some sort of collective memory to the space when we're talking about, right? So,
okay,
yeah.
Sorry, Ali. I might need to just read the last comment from Pedro, and then we probably need to wrap up the session because time's almost up. So from Pedro, many of the discussion about trade are about links between metropoles and area of extraction. A very significant trade that kept Australian mercantile groups visible was the country trade between local entities. This was true for Portuguese and later the Dutch VOC and English EIC. All right, well, Stuart, I think we better wrap up this session.
Oh, so look, I'd just like to say thank you to Ali, to Jean and Noni and Jane and Victoria for 3 fascinating papers. And thank you everybody for the questions and comments and the discussion that we've had around these papers. If anyone hasn't had a chance to view the full papers, I really encourage you to do so. Yeah, so please do. And I guess also just keep in mind and don't forget that we have the keynote this evening at 6:30 p.m. Melbourne time, whatever that is, where you are.
7:30 London or 15:30 Singapore time.
So with Professor Alex Bremner from the University of Edinburgh. Thank you everybody for a fantastic final session to the conference.
Thanks everyone, brilliant.
Thanks Stuart and Amanda.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, good to see you all. Thank you.